Good morning. And so this morning on the news we heard about the carbon floor price and suggestions that the Chancellor is looking to abolish it, and I'd like to take a minute as I'm walking up the hill to say why I think it is possibly one of the more important policies that we should be looking to keep, possibly one of the most important policies in the world. Excuse me while I cross the road. So the carbon floor price, or carbon price floor we seem to call it these days, is there to make up for the fact that the European Emissions Trading Scheme has so many permits in it that it is actually very cheap to burn coal and to emit carbon. And the carbon price floor was a unilateral measure voted for by the Liberal Democrat Conference in September 2010 and introduced by Chris Huhne to say that, okay, going forward, however many permits are flooded into the emissions trading scheme, there is at least a minimum price you're going to pay for emitting carbon. And by doing this, A, yes, he's raised a little bit of money, but B, more importantly, he's lent some certainty to generators in this country that there is at least some value in investing in low carbon generation, in renewables and nuclear and so on. So that's a good thing, and we're at risk of forgetting that. But I think there's a larger picture here. Why has the emissions trading scheme been flooded with permits? Well, because it's politically easy to do. The demands were there. It's very difficult, and it's fairly invisible. There was no big outcry, really, because how do we, as members of the public, how do journalists know that a certain number of permits is okay and another number is just too many? It's a difficult judgment to make. Had the policy in the first place been across Europe been expressed in terms of price floors rather than permits that could be traded, then it's more likely that it's more likely that the headline price of a permit, you're going to have to pay €5 or €10 or €20 or whatever it is for emitting a ton of Europe. That's a very, that's a meaningful figure. It's a figure that means something that we can understand, and therefore it's politically more difficult to back away from it the first time you get lobbied by industry or there's some bad news on the economy. So it's a tragedy we didn't go for price floors all along. Internationally, emissions trading has never got anywhere, so that's and there's no real surprise about that. For an international agreement on emissions trading to exist, countries would need to be able to agree massive wealth transfers between each other, and realistically that's never going to happen, is it? So internationally, emissions trading has never got anywhere for understandable reasons. If we were aiming to achieve carbon reductions through a price floor, that would still be difficult, but to my mind surely that's going to be easier than trying to do it through emissions trading, because when you impose a price floor there's a source of revenue there that the government imposing it can keep, and therefore we're talking about not transfers between countries but just a different way for governments to tax their own economies. And if a government wants to, it can spend the revenue it raises from carbon taxes. Excuse me, I'm going uphill a bit here now. Revenue and carbon taxes. It can spend that on reducing other taxes, on reducing national insurance, for example, or corporation tax, or it can spend it on energy efficiency measures, much like the ECO, the energy company's obligation, which is one of the other kind of green tariffs that seems to be in the Chancellor's fire these days. So it seems to be a much more likely prospect that we'd ever reach international agreement, whether in Europe or even wider, on an agreement whereby governments simply agree to tax their own carbon emissions a certain amount, or a certain fraction of maybe something related to the size of their economy rather than even the same amount, and that would be much more likely to be achievable than an agreement that effectively required big transfers of wealth. And if we make that kind of agreement on reducing carbon emissions more achievable, then that could make a difference. That could be the most critical policy that has ever been introduced. And so, for that reason, I'm unhappy at today's news on the government, or the Chancellor rather, wanting to back away from the carbon price floor. I think the Liberal Democrats ought to be more enthusiastic about it, and I did put an amendment down for the last conference when the issue came up, saying carbon price floor, ought to be in there and welcomed, but it wasn't chosen for debate. So here I am on my way out this morning, just making this recording just to record those views, and do ask me any questions if you're not sure. Thank you. Bye.